So the language and the imagery we get on this Sunday as we look for hope is flowers in the desert, streams in the sand. Very helpfully, I can give you another analogy this morning. If you look up, there are at least 4 balloons on our ceiling, and maybe others that we didn't find. So yesterday we had our Angel Tree Christmas extravaganza. Extravaganza is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I don't know about you, but I've been to a couple extravaganzas that when I got there, I thought, this is not an extravaganza. This is just a small gathering of people. This yesterday is an extravaganza. If you've never seen it before, which I had not seen it before yesterday, right over there was a bounce house, and like not the small one, but the one that reaches up to the balcony and stretches all the way over. Then there was a full-blown like Fantasy of Trees section going on over here with ornament decorating and cookie decorating and games and all kinds of good stuff. And then over where you find folks are sitting is food that was chosen exclusively based on what would children like to eat most. So it was dumb. As a parent of 2, when I saw it, I thought, yep, that's exactly right. Pizza, Cheetos, chips, Cool Ranch Doritos, and then some grapes thrown in for good measure as well, cupcakes and cake. And then here in the middle were a bunch of tables with families. And we do this as part of our Angel Tree ministry because everyone in this church, all of our angel trees go for children who have a loved one in prison. So when these folks come here and when you provide gifts for them, you are providing something that they have a loved one who is literally unable to do that. And in the midst of all these different stories and all these different hardships, we spend a couple hours on one Saturday in December showing hope and fun and joy and all kinds of stuff. And then through your generosity, we're able to provide for them as well. But it was so much fun that a few balloons escaped us. Yesterday, Jim Burgess had a long pole and was doing like an Olympic event trying to get these balloons down. And we got most of them down, but there are a few left up there. So when we hear in this story about looking for hope, there's this idea that it's streams in the desert, it's streams in the sand, flowers in the desert, maybe a balloon or 2 on the ceiling. Something that stands apart from everything else that someone may be walking through. And we've been walking through this series and talking about this early messianic language because you and I can only look back on Bethlehem, but there was a time when you could only look forward to it. There was a time when Messiah was only a promise, and it was a promise to a group of people who needed hope. Isaiah is a book that is written over a long stretch of years, and we believe that at some point over the course of that book, the people of Judah move from pre-exile to in captivity. That they've been carried off to Babylon, they are full on in captivity, and there is some biblical scholarship that suggests that the language we heard this morning, streams in the desert and flowers in the sand, is early captivity language. Now the bad thing has happened. And the call for these people is still to be someone who looks for hope, even when it's mostly desert, mostly sand, 1 or 2 balloons on a big, wide ceiling. There's this truth when we talk about looking for Jesus and looking for Messiah. There's this truth that happens that even though we may look for a long time, and even though a lot of us may look together, we never get it exactly right. That even though we take the time to look, and even though people back then took the time to look and study about what Messiah would be, we never get it quite right. And this is not, we know this from our story, not just because there weren't a ton of people at Bethlehem waiting on Jesus to arrive. Even at the end of the story, Jesus goes to a cross where he will die mostly alone. People who believed in him, disciples who believed in him, it wasn't a matter that they didn't believe that he was the one, it's that they didn't get it exactly right. They didn't fully understand what it meant to be the one. They didn't fully understand what it meant to be Messiah. no matter how hard or how long you look, there's always this truth that it's hard for us to get it exactly right. And this is why when we think about Christ coming again, which is something that you and I can only look forward to, we can't look back on. This is why I get a little nervous when people want to give like very concrete and specific details about the return of God. I believe Christ has died and Christ is risen and Christ will come again. But whenever we get deep down into, well, it's going to look exactly like this, that makes me nervous because they missed it once already. Even when they were looking for it, even when they were looking for him, they still missed it. No matter how long or how hard we look, or no matter how many of us are looking, sometimes we still don't get it exactly right. And this is true. I mean, think about it this way. Any of y'all watch that show, The Crown? Anybody watches The Crown? A few of you are like, sort of. That's how I watch The Crown too. When I say we watch The Crown, I mean Alex watches it and I lay in bed next to her and play on my phone while she's watching it. And then I catch like glimpses of it that the history major in me is like, I'm not so sure about that, and things like that. And then I do that thing that is a terrible thing that all of us do where it's like, I've got strong opinions about that show. Have you seen it? Sort of. I've seen it laying in bed kind of while I was on my phone, but I've got strong opinions about it. The royal family, especially right now, especially with Queen Elizabeth passing this year, that's a group of people that are probably still one of the most documented and studied and written about and talked about and podcasted about and TV movied about groups of people walking the face of the earth. But the breadth and width of the number of people watching and talking and doing all of that has not automatically led us to a greater consensus about what those group of people are truly like, right? Having more eyes on them has not automatically led all of us to being like, oh yeah, we totally agree about all of these things. We totally agree about the percentage of blame that should be placed on Prince Charles or Princess Diana or whatever. Just because more people are looking does not automatically lead to this thing where more and more of us come to the same understanding of what happens. And no one in history has been more studied, written about, podcasted about, TV movied about, preached about, talked about, you name it about it, than Jesus. We've been doing this for 2,000 years. And still, with all of these eyes, I mean, there's whole institutions that we talk about him every Sunday. And we still have not, with all of our eyes looking, have not come to a more unified, concrete understanding of who he is. In fact, sometimes it seems to be the opposite that takes place. Alan Culpepper, who wrote a commentary on Luke that I really like, says this: no biographical issue in human history compares with the effort to understand Jesus. We have not one but 4 gospels painting 4 different portraits of Jesus. Church councils developed confessions that state his role and identity. Artists have adapted Jesus to various cultures and centuries. Historians and scholars have proposed first one understanding, then another. Maybe he was a rationalist who performed few miracles. Maybe he was a liberal who taught the fatherhood of God and the ethic of love and human community. Maybe he was a prophet announcing the coming end of all things and new beginnings. An existentialist calling for radical obedience and openness to the future. A social reformer, a Galilean peasant, and the parade of portraits goes on and on and on. In different churches with different names on the sign, or even some churches with the same name as the denomination on the sign, we get slightly different portraits and views of someone that we spend a lot of time looking at every week. Just because we're all looking is no guarantee that we'll get it exactly right. And I say all that to say this, that one of the people who was closest to Jesus in our story still struggles to get it exactly right. When we talk about all these people who've been studied and documented and all of that, it can sometimes lead to the question of who's the greatest? Who's the greatest person that's ever lived? If we take Jesus, it's church, Jesus is supposed to be the right answer, right? But if we take Jesus out of the equation, you'll get arguments for Napoleon, you'll get arguments for Plato and Aristotle, you'll get arguments for politicians, leaders, kings, poets, all kinds of things. But Jesus, at least in his day and age, when they ask or the question is raised, who is the greatest? This is a question Jesus actually answers. Here's Matthew 11, in verse 11. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, among those born of women, which I'm pretty sure is all of us, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet, the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Among those born of women, no one has risen greater than John the Baptist, yet the least in the kingdom is greater than he. So Jesus points out and says, if you're looking for the greatest among us, John the Baptist, who prepared the way, who enters the story at Advent. Mary is pregnant with Jesus at the same time. Elizabeth is pregnant with John. They're cousins. They walk this road together from the very beginning. John prepares the way. John baptizes Jesus, even though he doesn't really want to. John is very, very confident. John uses this word to say, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And then John gets arrested, and Jesus continues to do ministry. And a few verses before Jesus calls him the greatest, John asks this question. This is 9 verses before Jesus calls John the greatest. This is Matthew 11, starting in verse 2. When John the Baptist heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go tell John what you hear and what you see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me," or that can also be translated as, "who does not stumble on my account." John's in prison, and Jesus is out doing Jesus things. And John, he of full faith and the greatest of all, and at the beginning of the story and all that, John asks this question: is it you? Are you the one? Or are we to look for another? Eugene Boring, who wrote a commentary on Matthew that I really like, says this idea of looking for another doesn't even mean necessarily that it has to be another person. It could just be another kind of Messiah. Did we get it wrong? Are you the one, or should we look for something else? And maybe John asked this question because he's in prison. But maybe John asked this question just because he's a person, and like all of us, and sometimes Jesus can act in ways that confuse us, or, if we're being honest, disappoint us, or just sometimes do things that make us say, is this really what this is all about? John says, are you the one? The greatest still asks this question of, are we sure about this? And Jesus gives John in response the language that we heard read here. It's the Isaiah 35 language. Here's verses 5 and 6 of it on the screen. This is what you heard Sharon read just a few minutes ago. The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. Waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. When John asks, are you the one? What Jesus gives him to affirm it is this old Isaiah 35 language. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap. There are indeed streams in the desert. There are indeed flowers in the sand. Even the greatest needs to be reminded that if you want to look for Messiah, the call is to look for hope. To be a group of people who look for Messiah is to be a group of people who look for flowers in the desert, streams in the sand, balloons on the ceiling. To be a Messiah-seeking people is to look for hope. Now, here's the hard part. You ready? This is Christmas. We don't like hard parts, especially 2 weeks before Christmas. I'm very sorry about that, but here's the hard part, okay? Jesus tells John, yes, I'm the one, and I can affirm it by saying, you look for hope. The blind see, the deaf hear, all of that. No, I'm the one because there's hope. But what's going to happen to John? Is John going to get out of prison? John's going to be executed not too long ahead in the story. So there is this very real and difficult tension in this idea that to look for Messiah is to be a group of people who look for hope, even though sometimes the flowers that we want may not sprout or blossom when we want them to. And the call here is, can we be a group of people who still look for flowers anyway? Can we be a group of people who, despite our own sand, still look for streams? When Jesus says, blessed are those who take no offense to me or who do not stumble on account of me, I think this is part of it. To look for Messiah is to look for hope. But in John's case, even for the greatest born of women, that specific hope will not manifest itself in his story. He's given the general hope in prison. Yes, I'm the one. You should know it from the Isaiah language. The blind see, the deaf hear. But for John, his chapter of the story still ends in prison. And this, I think, is why Jesus says, blessed are those who don't stumble over this, because it is an awfully easy thing to stumble over. And so what we're called to do is to remember the big hope that we find, the larger hope that we find in Jesus. And can that inspire us to find flowers along the way, or streams in the sand, or one or two balloons on the ceiling, even when it's a lot of ceiling and a lot of sand and a lot of desert? Because the truth is, hope is hard. Cynicism is super easy. I'm not sure what it costs you to be cynical other than hope. Hope costs. Hope is risky. And more, the default setting of this world is cynicism. Mostly, I think, because it's easy. But the language of Messiah, from the beginning, from Isaiah, the language of Messiah is to look for hope, to be a group of people who look for flowers anyway, who still look for streams, who still look for, and not just look for, but blow up and celebrate balloons in places that need good news. These things we've been walking through, these things we've been talking about, all of them are hard, especially in response to the way our world operates. The default setting on this world seems to be cynicism, and we're called to look for hope. The default setting a lot of times is conflict, and we're called to look for peace. And the default setting a lot of times is division, and we're called to look for unity. Here's what I think. If you do this long enough, this following Jesus thing long enough, this church thing long enough, sooner or later, you will have times when you prayed for flowers and they didn't come. But also, if you do this Jesus thing long enough, you will have times when you prayed for flowers and something unexpected happened. And the call for us is to be a group of people, because we have the larger hope in Christ, to still be a group of people who look for hope. Even if we as a church were a hopeful, non-cynical, or less cynical, if we're being realistic, looking people, even that by itself would speak volumes into this world, just to be a group of people who were persistent about looking for hope. And the truth, too, is when Tiana shared last week about our differences, the different parts of that murmuration of birds and being brought together, not just in spite of those things, but because of those things. One of our biggest differences sometimes is those who have seen flowers bloom most recently and those who haven't. Every week we walk in here in different places carrying different burdens, some of us carrying things we are incredibly grateful to have seen, and others of us desperate to see them. And I think if we do this long enough, we'll always end up being both. But in the midst of that difference, of being a group of people who are carrying different things every time we enter here, we bring our different experiences of hope and hurt, of who Jesus is and who sometimes we wished he was. That too is a call for unity and a call together to hope. Can we be a group of people who still look for flowers in the desert? That old story, that early messianic language, that Isaiah passage in chapter 35, it ends this way in verse 10. Those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing, and everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. Sorrow and sighing will flee away. O come, Emmanuel.
Hey, thanks for joining us online. You can find us Sunday mornings at 9:30 or 11 a.m. at 323 West Emory Road in Powell, just off I-75 past the Kroger Marketplace. You can also join us for recovery worship on Thursday nights. To learn more about our church and get connected, visit powellchurch.com. You can find all kinds of information under the I'm New section. And if you'd like to support the mission of Powell Church, we appreciate your generosity. There's information on the screen that helps you get connected through stewardship and your giving. We hope this day's been a good one for you and that the grace of God has made itself known in your life. Have a great week.